Good morning and welcome to day 23, bilateral integration of motor skills. By now, your children should have got working on postural control. They should have got their primitive reflexes sorted, and you're really looking at how left and right work together. And this is a really vital stage of development. Great long list of things you need to check. So we know the primitive reflexes. The first thing following on is, can they work symmetrically with both sides of the body? Then the next thing, can they work moving in opposite movements reciprocally? Then can they do one thing with one hand and another with the other? Think, playing the violin, cutting out paper, whatever. Can they cross the midline is an important check. And finally, have we got them walking with opposite arm and leg? Have we got them skipping? Have we got them moving generally with opposite arm and leg? So let's get a move on. We've got symmetrical bilateral integration. Use things like rolling pins, things like clapping, hanging on to ropes and so on, bunny hopping, whatever it is, get them going. And I'm sure you can think of lots more things than I can. All the time you're doing it, you have got to really look out for, are the children turning one arm off? It is really important. It is really important that you keep an eye on it, because if that is happening, then quite simply you've got to sort it out. And it might be vision, it might be sound, it might be primitive reflexes, it might be just they're lazy. Get it sorted, because it could cause big learning difficulties later. Once we've got the symmetrical going, we get the reciprocal going, and things like bicycling, obviously, but that's quite a hard thing to do. So try and do simpler moves, pattern those moves inside, pattern the moves and help the child do them. Help the child move from being helpless on a rope to being able to work with reciprocal movements. Use things like dance moves, anything to get that reciprocal bilateral integration going. I went and had a good look at asymmetrical, thinking it would be easy. And as you know, I steal everything from the internet. Actually, I was quite shocked by what I found. So our first boy, really pleased, he is sitting upright. He is working with his limbs without any props. So he can cut and hold a piece of paper. That is really good. He's isolating his motor skill movements. Your little girl there cannot. She's all propped on the table. That is very bad motor skills. She's not isolating the motor skills properly. She is using the table, etc., just to prop up her body. She's not got good brain control over her posture. She hasn't got good control over her individual limbs. It must be stopped. She must learn really good development. The second little girl, there she is, cutting on one side. That's telling you where midline crossing isn't looking too hot, but also she's got that gesture around her mouth, and that's telling you she's got retained primitive reflexes. The table is too big as well. She's in the wrong position. So make sure the furniture works, make sure the child sorted out primitive reflexes, make sure the child is working centrally and equally with both sides. On we go, all sorts of things you could do. I also looked at threading beads, because that seemed like something one was doing slightly different things with one hand than the other. And again, it reminded me, you need to look, is it going over the midline? Are we working that way? Or are we going down? In which case we are not midline crossing, and we're back at retained primitive reflexes, or we need to learn how to work across. So all sorts of things you forget are there, you need to start really looking for. Crossing the midline is a real mission in itself. And you can get kids, the little dinky cars, taking them around roadways. They're simply sitting there and they are working round. And you're making sure they're central to the figure of 8 and they're working across their midline. And you make sure they can do it with both hands. You can paint figures of 8, you can draw figures of 8, you can do what you want with them. To be honest, they get a bit boring. To razz up the excitement, the sorts of things I like are throwing a ball over the midline. That tells me a huge amount, but it's quite a complex move. But I'm interested, can the child get the ball over the midline? Are they making involuntary movements with their head and body? I'm interested whether the ball falls before the midline, because that's telling us a real problem getting over that midline. When the ball gets over the midline, can they catch it, or are they completely unaware of where it is? So the simple act of throwing a ball in an arc across the midline is telling me a lot about integrated sound, vision, motor skills. It's really important. Before we get to that stage, you might want to do simpler things to build the skill up. So things like putting pegs on a line, but you need to put a knot in the middle of that line so the child knows where the middle is. And you often have to supervise that or get another child to supervise it. The child stays still while they put the pegs on the line and they go across their midline, taking them on and off with both arms. And they're looking at what they're doing as well. So we're getting the limbs and the vision going across the midline. What you find is when the child's got problems midline crossing, they move or they do strange things, which is all to avoid crossing the midline. Playing patter cake, going across, again, really good, and try and look for involuntary body movements. Think about other things. Nicola Laterza, who I work with, who's an Italian sound therapist, does amazing things with children, and he treats skateboards like bodyboards. He gets the kids doing obstacle courses, challenges where they've got to cross their midline and pick things up while they push their way around the room. It's very exciting. Kids love it. They'll practice and practice and practice. That's what you want. He also uses some very good, very stretchy sports bands, and so they're pulling and pulling and pulling. Anything that builds that resistance in children where things haven't got off to a good start, the more push you can give on this midline crossing, the better. Because when it comes together, things really do work a lot better. You might have worked really hard, everything has gone, you know, you've got the primitive reflexes, you're really sure they're working, but for the life of you cannot get the midline crossing working. And what you need to do is have a look and see whether what's happened is the vision has got stuck, and whether the vision needs separate exercises to get the eyes to cross the midline. So here you can see my splendid, expensive model. And he is taking beads from one pot, looking at them, going over his midline and putting them firmly in the next pot. And he's going back and forth, and you need to use both hands and go back and forth, and you're going in an arc and the eyes are crossing the midline. When you're looking at the child doing this, you want to be looking to see if there's any jump at all at the midline by the eyes. If you've got big visual issues, you may well be working one eye at a time to do this. The eyes need to cross the midline. When they do, the ball starts working better across the midline, and so on. And this is going to be a problem, particularly if children have had retained primitive reflexes for a long time. So particularly your post 6, 7, you need to look at these very specifically. So we've got all those bits in place, and we're now we need to get opposing limbs working, and we need to get them working really well and on every plane, because it's important for maths. The child can work on every plane. It's also a very important check that everything has come together properly. So we really want them skipping forwards and eventually skipping backwards. We want them to be able to panther crawl. And when you're panther crawling, you are putting one hand forward and the opposite leg you're kicking with. And then you change sides. When I'm doing it with children, I often have to pattern it for them. I am holding their hand. I am putting my other hand under their heel, getting them to feel what it feels like to kick with one foot and pull with one hand, and kick with one foot and pull with one hand. Really important to get that feeling, but once they get it, they're away. And there are lots of games you can play with panther crawling that makes it exciting. I want to see that children can walk properly, heel to toe, with opposing limbs. And we need to practice that. Children need for life to have a really good walking movement. And it needs to be well established with everything underlying it, all the primitive reflexes, everything else in place. I want to see they can do jumping jacks. So if they're going to do jumping jacks, I might be using a metronome. I want to see top and bottom work equally. And I want to see that they can just keep going very nicely, very rhythmically. I will look at angels in the snow. I want them to lie on the floor, eyes closed, and I'm going to ask them to move opposite arm and leg. So left arm, right leg. And I don't want any involuntary movement of any other limb. I want them to be able to move opposing limbs without any strange wiggling of the body or anything else, no jaw clamping. I want to be absolutely certain that we have got really good bilateral integration. The bottom image is what I call Superman crawling. A person starts on all fours and you ask them to lift up and point out straight their opposite arm and leg. I want a really nice, straight, stable person. I don't want any twisting. I don't want any wobble. I want the foot to be flat, the person to be able to hold that straight. It's telling me a lot about their bilateral integration. It's telling me a lot about their core strength. If they can't do this, I need to go back and get all the foundations in place until they can. So it's an important goal for a 7-8-year-old. And finally, of course, the skipping backwards. Some children, when we start, can't skip. So again, you're going to need to pattern it. You're going to need literally to pull up one arm, pull up the other leg and get them to feel that, and then pull up the opposites. And just stepping and moving the opposites to begin with helps them get in their heads, that movement, and eventually it will come. All of those skills need to be in place, really, in order for our children to be able to manipulate tools properly. And a pen is a tool. And if these are not in place, they cannot manipulate tools properly. It's uncomfortable. And they can't operate across the midline. They can't operate properly across the midline for reading. Vital skills, vital for maths, because you don't know where you are in space. So I cannot say enough. I want our children to be fit to learn. I often have a look at school websites. I am often absolutely horrified at the state of the children in this country. And these are private school children. All of these are taken from private schools where I understand they have got well-trained PE staff. It's not state schools where someone's shoveling it in as an extra on their curriculum or they've contracted it out. And I'm not seeing good movement. I'm not seeing really proper movement. And to give you an idea of what our children ought to be looking like, I've put up some leading sports players. And all our children at 7-8 should be looking like this. This should be our expectation. The third image of the sports players is the younger Usain Bolt. Absolutely beautiful. You've got the arm moving from the shoulder. There's not strange body movement. It is a very, very efficient movement. The body is straight. The airways are working. The whole body works properly. That ought not to be an exception. It ought to be the standard. And that is what we have to work towards. Back in 2018, me and my co-directors dragged our poor local MP out to look at children in our area in Croydon. And we looked at 400 plus children by the time we managed to get our appointments right with the MP. And of those 400 plus children, all 8 years plus, 90% had motor skills problems that would affect their numeracy and literacy, that were going to affect them for life. That is beyond wicked, and we as a society have got to support better child development. I come from a teaching background. I got into this because I was sick of teaching 16 plus students who couldn't do the most basic things. My co-director, Mel Healy, is an outstanding sports therapist, works at St Mary's University. My other co-director, Diane Smith, is an outstanding visual therapist working with vision and the whole body. Together, our skills tell us we're in a national crisis. We have got to set better expectations, and so important for everyone's health and employment and equal opportunities. So thank you for listening to me. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, and have a good day.